Hello class. In this lecture we'll be going over Chapter 2 of American Government 2nd edition by Glenn Krutz, which is available at no cost to you at openstax.org. This video is copyright yours truly. Our objective is to understand the workings of the U.S. Congress, its powers, its responsibilities, and the composition and the requirements of its members. So that's the U.S. Capitol building. It's massive. It is mostly open to the public. You can see that the two wings on each side were added at a different time. And then there's a big mall or lawn in front of it. So Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution vests all legislative, that is, lawmaking power in the United States Congress. If you read Article 1 and you get down to Section 8, there's actually a bulleted list of all the powers that Congress has. That includes raising revenue or taxes, declaring war, providing for the defense, and providing for general welfare. It also includes the ability to make laws respecting bankruptcy and naturalization and a bunch of other things. Our Congress is bicameral. There is an upper house, or an upper chamber, the Senate, and a lower chamber, the House of Representatives. The two different chambers have different electoral timetables. When we talk about a particular Congress, we're really talking about a 2-year period. So the 114th Congress went from January of 2015 through December of 2016. The seats in the House are up for election every 2 years. In the Senate, the seats are up for election every 6 years, unless someone gets up and leaves or passes away. Under normal circumstances, the Senate elections are staggered, so that in any even-numbered year, only 1/3 of Senate seats are actually up for re-election. What this essentially means is that in an election year, only 2/3 of the senators are actually worried about re-election. However, every U.S. representative is worried about re-election in every election year, or even-numbered year. There are 435 U.S. representatives. There are some non-voting representatives from Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and Guam. But they don't really count because they don't vote. The 435 U.S. representatives are apportioned to the 50 states according to population. Every 10 years, we have a census in this country. The Constitution says that we have to have a census every 10 years. The 2020 census apportionment will not come out until April of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. And so we also have 100 senators, 2 for each state, regardless of their population. I should point out that the members of the House of Representatives have always been directly elected by the public. Conversely, up until 1913, senators were selected by state legislatures until the 17th Amendment was ratified in 1913, as it says there on the PowerPoint. Let's talk about the House. The formal leader is the Speaker of the House. This person is elected by a majority of the majority. So when the Democrats have a majority in the House, and because the House has an odd number of representatives, one side will typically always have a majority, then the Democrats will select the Speaker. When the Republicans have control of the House, then the Republicans select the Speaker. There is a majority leader and a majority whip, and there is a minority leader and a minority whip. The Whip is a person who is supposed to get the members of the party to vote in line with the rest of the party, with varying levels of success. The primary tool that a majority whip has, or a minority whip has, is funding, because all the candidates will need funding to run for re-election. Now, these are formal posts. They get the Speaker of the House gets a higher salary than other members of the House, and so forth, and a larger staff. In the Senate, their formal leader is the President of the Senate, who is the Vice President of the United States. The President pro tempore does most of the day-to-day, calling a session and so forth. Typically the most senior majority party member. And there's always a majority and a minority leader, and a majority and a minority whip. However, the whip has a lot less power in the Senate because, again, the elections are staggered in the Senate, so that in an election year, 2/3 of the senators aren't really worried about re-election. When we talk about the Senate and the leaders of the Senate, we talk more about the majority leader and the minority leader. Most people could not tell you who the President pro tempore of the Senate is. Now, there are two major views of how elected legislators should behave. There is the trustee view. This is associated, I think, with Edmund Burke, that a politician should vote as he or she believes is right, and then, when it's time for an election, that politician has to go and face the public and their judgment of his judgment. Another perspective is the delegate perspective, that a politician should vote as his or her constituents wish. The constituents are the people back home in the district or the state. In this view, the delegate is basically a conduit for the will of the people. Now, which is best? I will say that the delegate position, you tend to see that in the House, that they are just a conduit for the people back in the district. And so the views that you hear from Nancy Pelosi are pretty much what a majority of the people in San Francisco believe. San Francisco is a very liberal city. And the same is true on the other side of the party, or of the chamber, that a Republican in a Republican majority district will typically state the views that the majority of the people in that district hold. Which is best? I don't know. It's in the Senate where you tend to see more trustees, where people will often defy the party whip and vote as they feel is right. For example, Mitt Romney voted to convict Donald Trump on one count when Trump was impeached, despite that they are both Republicans. And so I believe he was acting as a trustee there, and then he'll have to face the public in Utah when he goes for re-election. Representation. There are two views of representation, and they can overlap. There's descriptive representation, where the persons elected reflect the ethnic and gender diversity of the population. So, for example, if African Americans are around 15% of the population, you would expect for about 15% of the members of Congress to be African American. Now, there are some countries that have quotas. I believe India, in their national Congress, they have a quota that there's a minimum number of female representatives in their national Congress. I don't think quotas would work in the U.S. because the people who hold the party slots that is the party nominees, are selected by the public. They're not selected by the party. And so I don't think there could ever be a workable quota system in the United States. And then there's also substantive representation, which is distinct from descriptive representation. Substantive representation refers to a representative whose views reflect the views of the voters back home. Now, take Sarah Palin, for example. If Sarah Palin were to run for Congress, she might descriptively represent 50% of the population through her gender by being a female, but there are probably a large number of females who disagree with many of her policy points. My point here is that descriptive representation does not always equal substantive representation, although there are certain shared perspectives. Legislating in the U.S. is actually very difficult. When you read the Constitution, or when I read the Constitution, I read a document that seems to have been designed to prevent sweeping social changes. There are a number of veto points. There are a number of places where any bill can fail. First of all, what I haven't put here, the majority of bills die in committee, and we'll talk about committees in a moment. But for a bill to become a law, it must first pass with a majority in the House. It must pass with a majority in the Senate, and in the Senate there's a special condition called the filibuster and the cloture rule that we will also be talking about in a few minutes. And then it must be signed by the President of the United States. So right there's 3 potential veto points. And I would argue it's by design. It's supposed to be difficult to enact new legislation. The Constitution is a document that largely preserved the status quo that the people who wrote it were familiar with. Now, the majority of work done in Congress is done in the committees. They discuss and revise and amend bills before passing them to the floor for debate. The committees oversee all federal programs, including foreign policy. The committees reconcile versions of bills that have been passed by both chambers. In a typical Congress, there are thousands of bills introduced. The vast and overwhelming majority of them die in the committees. Either the committee will just sit on it for a while, which frequently happens, or they'll discuss it and vote it down, and it will never reach the full chamber. That's reality. That's more efficient than having all 435 representatives and all 100 senators sit there and debate each and every bill that gets proposed in front of the entire chamber. A roll call vote is a public yea or nay vote on a bill. In the House, no bill reaches a vote unless it's supported by a majority of the majority. So if the House is in the control of the Democrats, no bill will reach the floor unless it's supported by a majority of the Democrats, and vice versa for when the House is controlled by Republicans. In the Senate, you cannot end debate without a 60-vote majority. This is called the cloture rule. This is particular to the U.S. Senate. Senators have the right to debate endlessly. The filibuster is a tactic of delaying a vote on a bill by refusing to yield the floor. Famously, I think Strom Thurmond in 1957 filibustered for over 20 hours, I think, trying to prevent a civil rights bill from being enacted by the chamber and by the Congress. To end a filibuster, the Senate must take a cloture vote, where 60 senators vote to end a filibuster and call a vote. This is very difficult to do. And in fact, because of this requirement, there are far fewer bills that are passed by the Senate than are passed by the House. You need a supermajority to get anything through the Senate, because there's 100 senators, but you need 60 votes to cast a vote. Seniority. What is seniority? Seniority refers to the status of how long you have been in a certain position. Does seniority equal skill or merit? Not necessarily, although in some cases it can. In some cases, in particular with something like the U.S. Congress, where there are a bunch of arcane rules and regulations to follow. Sometimes the fact that you've been there the longest makes you a lot better at figuring out how to get your bill through the committee and to the chamber. So Congress has a seniority system. Seniority is often the way that they determine their party leadership positions. And then in particular, the seats on the high-profile committees are typically determined by seniority. Now, seniority and service go hand in hand. Members of Congress provide services to their constituents. Their constituents, again, are the people back home in the district or the state. Pork barrel, that term refers to projects that are often added to bills for the support of key members. This typically takes the form of infrastructure, money to build a bridge somewhere, or a library, or something, or a new building. There are federal buildings in every state, and where those buildings are located is often determined by the power of the individual representative for that district. That's also true with military bases. So when running for Congress, there are really two elections. There's a primary election, where you have to win a party nomination for your district. Typically in the primary election, only party members vote. Now there are some states that have open primaries, there are some states that sort of have hybrid primaries, but typically you can only vote in one party primary at a time. Usually the Republican primary election has voters who are more conservative than the general public. Likewise, in the Democratic primary, you have voters who are more liberal than the general public. This graph shows the left-right political spectrum. On the left, you see liberal. On the right, you see conservative. And then in the center is the moderate ideological position. In the Democratic primaries, candidates will often adopt liberal positions over on the left. Likewise, Republican candidates will adopt conservative positions over on the right. In the general election, however, candidates often move to the moderate center because that's where the votes are. Americans overall, in the aggregate, that is when you put them all together, are actually very moderate on nearly all issues. And so candidates will often move to the center to try to catch those moderate voters and to keep the opposition from getting them. Gerrymandering is the act of drawing House districts in a manner that favors one group, typically a party. Partisan gerrymandering occurs when the districts are drawn along party lines. And what the state legislature will do is they will look at each precinct and see what percentage did the Democratic presidential candidate get in the last presidential election. And what percentage did the Republican nominee get in the last presidential election? That's how you can tell the composition of the district with regards to partisanship. They can also look at the voter rolls and see the number of registered Democrats and the number of registered Republicans. I'm not saying that they can see who voted for whom, but party registration is public, and the results of the last presidential election, that is the count of the votes, is also public. Partisan gerrymandering is legal. It sounds shady, but there's a very good argument that could be made that partisan gerrymandering is possibly very good. The argument is that if a large group of Republicans are represented by a Republican in Congress, they will tend to be happier. Likewise, if a large group of Democrats are represented by a Democrat in Congress, they will probably be happier. So, for example, San Francisco is sort of a natural congressional district just because of its size. It's about 500,000 people. And so the majority of registered voters in San Francisco are registered as Democrats, and so they're happier being represented by Nancy Pelosi, a Democrat, than they would be if they were represented by, say, Kevin McCarthy of the Republican Party, who's very conservative. Now, on the other hand, racial gerrymandering is drawing a district along racial lines, and this is super duper illegal. North Carolina got in trouble for this a few years ago. The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. The reality is that there are certain areas that have a substantial African American population, like, say, the south side of Chicago or Gary, Indiana. So there's going to be a sort of a natural African American district there. Now that's allowed as long as you have a district with a majority of African Americans just because of geography, just because there happen to be a large number of African Americans living in that particular part of the state. And that might actually be good. That ensures that there's going to be at least one African American from the Illinois caucus. So let's talk a bit more about gerrymandering. Here you've got 50 precincts. 60% of them are blue, 40% are red. You could draw those 50 precincts into 5 districts in such a way that there are 5 districts where the majority of the precincts are blue. You could also really redraw it in such a manner so that the 5 districts have 3 red majorities and 2 blue majorities. Now, U.S. congressional districts are drawn by state legislatures. There are a handful of states that have sort of created like this bipartisan committee to draw the districts and make them fair. But ultimately, it's the responsible of the state legislatures to draw the districts. Approximately 60% of legislatures are controlled by the Republican Party as of February 2nd, 2021. And then there are a substantial number of state legislatures that are divided between 2 parties, and then a significant number that are controlled by the Democrats, like Illinois and California. However, the Republican Party as a whole has placed a heavy emphasis on winning state legislative elections, whereas the Democrats have placed a heavy emphasis on winning the White House. A safe district is a district where over 50% of over 50% of House districts can be called safe for one party or the other. That's a safe district, a district that is totally safe for one party or the other. A district in downtown Chicago is pretty safe for the Democratic Party. By contrast, a district in rural Alabama is probably pretty safe for the Republican Party. In such districts, the primary election is essentially the only election. Consequently, politicians must appeal to their base rather than the general public. And so the most extreme statements that you hear from representatives in the House are from representatives who come from safe districts. For example, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, represents, I believe, the Bronx in New York. Well, that's a district that's very safe for the Democrats. Her primary election is the only election she has to worry about. No Republican is going to get elected from the Bronx in New York. And so she can afford to take the most extreme liberal positions possible. And the same is true on the other side of the aisle among Republicans. A Republican from a safe district will typically adopt some very pro-gun rights views and so forth. Why? Because their primary election, where they have to appeal to the party base, is effectively the only election in a safe district. So, going back to this concept of two elections, we've talked about the primary elections. After the party nominees are chosen, comes the general election, where the nominees have to face the general public. Most politicians, as I said in that little graphic, will move to the center. Is a move to the center necessary in a safe district? No. Again, in a safe district, the representative only has to worry about winning the primary. So AOC really only has to worry about other Democrats, because the Bronx is extremely unlikely to send a Republican to Congress. And so she can afford to be very vocal with very liberal positions. Let's talk for a moment about polarization and partisanship. The parties have become ideologically pure. If you recall my lecture on Chapter 1, the tendency since about 1980, well really since the 1970s, has been for conservatives to vote for Republicans and liberals to vote for Democrats. This was not always the case. In the 50s and the 60s, there were some socially liberal Republicans voting for civil rights legislation, and there were some socially conservative Democrats voting against civil rights legislation. Party line voting is hovering around 90%. Party line voting means what percent of Democrats voted with the Democrat-favored position and what percentage of Republicans voted with other Republicans. What we're seeing is a widespread unwillingness to find a middle ground. We're also seeing a reduction in legislative output. Remember, in the Senate, you need effectively a supermajority. You need 60 out of 100 votes just to bring a general roll call vote on a new piece of legislation. In fact, the Congress that I showed you, well actually the 113th Congress, was a Congress where the House was in control of the Republicans and the Senate was in control of Democrats, and it is, I think it holds the record for being the least productive Congress, the 113th Congress. I believe they sent the fewest number of bills to the president's desk of any Congress in history, besides like budget bills, which only need a simple majority. So, the House versus the Senate. The Senate electoral timetable allows for slower, deliberative action. Remember, only 1/3 of Senate seats are up for grabs at a time. There are also fewer safe Senate seats. Why? Well, Senators do not represent a district. They represent an entire state. And so the entire state will include both the large cities and the rural areas. Cross-party voting is also more common in the Senate. Again, these senators typically don't have to worry about re-election for many years, and they know that the public forgets very quickly. For me, it'll be interesting when Mitt Romney runs for re-election in, I believe, 2024. It'll be interesting how much discussion there is about his vote to convict Donald Trump within the Utah Republican primary. I can't predict the future. I don't have a crystal ball, but we'll see. Now, there are some very unique Senate powers. The advice and the consent of the Senate is necessary for presidential appointments to the federal court system, including the Supreme Court, and higher offices throughout the United States. The Senate is also necessary for the U.S. to enter into new treaties. The advice and consent function is one area where I believe that the Senate has sort of diminished its own standing. Appointments to the federal courts several years ago, when there was a Democrat majority, the Democrats eliminated the filibuster rule and the cloture rule for appointees to the federal court system. And then when the Republicans took control, they eliminated the cloture rule and the filibuster for appointees to the Supreme Court. So now all it takes to confirm an appointment to the federal courts is a simple majority in the Senate. Meaning that the president really only has to please his own party in making those appointments. And that contributes to the polarization of American politics, I would argue.